middle?
No, I will be there. Okay.
Where will you be there?
Ouais. Merci, Sandra. Merci beaucoup à vous deux.
Merci.
I'm not a journalist, so it should be
So we don't know
easier.
if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
I think it should be a good thing. So it's an honor to have you both with us today. Your presence is very important, especially that you were at the heart of laying down the foundation of this journey leading us to 2050. So my first question, you'll be able to both to answer, but Minister Guilbeault, maybe you could start. It's been just over 6 months since the federal government launched the emission reduction plan. And what progress have we made on actually implementing ERP over the past 6 months, first? And second, if you had to choose one specific thing that you are very proud of, what would it be?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me and my friend and colleague, Jonathan, here today. I feel like I should start with an apology. Because when I first called you to recruit you to ANZAB, you asked me, how much work was it going to be? And I said, well, a few hours here and there. And but what did I know? I was Heritage Minister, so I would be happy to throw under the bus the previous Environment Minister for that.
Apologies accepted.
Great. And second, I'd like to pick up on a few things that were said just before we came on stage. Emissions are starting to diminish in Canada. We only have, it's only the last 2 years, and we know obviously the 2019, 2020. And we know that because 2020, clearly there was the pandemic. But I think what the point the Prime Minister was making is an important one. We are in the process of changing the very fabric of our industrial complex in Canada, of our transportation system, of our buildings, of our agricultural sector. And to think that, unfortunately, there's no switch. Jonathan and I have been looking for the switch somewhere where it just happens. It doesn't just happen. It's a lot of hard work, and it's a continuous effort. You have to keep going at it every day. What am I most? Obviously, I think the emissions reduction plan was a lot of heavy lifting, building on the great work that Jonathan and his team had done before, and Catherine McKenna before that. But I think the ERP, as Environment Minister, it's not every day that you get to please just about everybody between Greenpeace and CAP.
I understand.
I don't have a lot of days like that. I can tell you that. So I think it was a great accomplishment in and of itself. But I see the ERP as our lighthouse. Like, this is what's guiding us to what we need to do. It's the first time in the history of Canada where we have a plan with measures, whether they'd be regulatory, fiscal measures, investment. We have pathways in terms of emissions to 2030 by sector. We've never had that in Canada before. As the Prime Minister was saying, now that we have that, we have to implement it. And the implementation, it obviously started before I arrived. But if you were to talk to the Deputy Minister from Environment and Climate Change Canada, Chris, who's somewhere here in the audience, she would probably tell you that she can't wait for me to go on vacation, and preferably an extended vacation. So what have we done in the last 6 months? Well, we've published regulations for the clean fuel standards. We're in the process of developing regulations for the oil and gas cap, the enhanced methane targets for 2030. We are en route to reduce methane emissions in the oil and gas sector by at least 40% in 2025. So things are happening, but we've made a commitment to be at 75% of methane reduction by 2030, which is, as far as I know, the most ambitious target of any country in the world, let alone an oil and gas producing country. Zero emission vehicle mandate, we're moving ahead with enhanced carbon pricing. I was in Washington a few weeks ago, and I was going through the list of the things that we were doing in Canada. I was meeting some of my peers, and you see their face change as you're talking. So you're doing pricing, and you're going to go to $170 in 2030, and you're doing ZEV, and you're doing methane, and you're doing an oil and gas cap, and you're doing a clean electricity standard. Every time I spoke, their face was changing. As the Prime Minister, I mean, they would love to do this, and they would love to do as much as we are, and we're so happy with IRA, and happy that they're doing that. But I think what I'm most proud of is the fact that we are standing our ground against a lot of opposition in Canada, and obviously the international situation isn't easy right now. And it would be, you know, it's always too difficult. Yeah. It's always too tough. But we're staying the course.
Great, Mr. Wilkinson, we had some thoughts.
So in terms of progress, I mean, let me just start by saying I couldn't agree more with what the Prime Minister said. And I should probably say normally we're actually the warm-up for the Prime Minister. It's the first time we've actually been the sort of penultimate thing.
Nope.
But that it's easy to set a target, which many countries around the world have done. I think one of the things of which I am most proud of the work that was done over the last few years, including very much the work that Steven did on the emissions reduction plan, is it is one of the most detailed climate plans that exists anywhere on the planet. And that's the test is, do you know how you're actually going to make the reductions in every sector of the economy that are going to have to be made if you're going to actually achieve your target? But you know, where the rubber hits the road is what progress are you seeing? And I would say you probably do need to think about that almost by sector as well. And I'm not going to go through everything, but there are a few areas where I would say, certainly on the transportation side, you've seen us doubling down in terms of the incentives to ensure that we're actually deploying in greater numbers electric vehicles. We are building out the electric vehicle infrastructure, and again, there was more money in the budget to ensure that we're actually creating the system that ensures people don't have range anxiety. And we're seeing results. I mean, in many provinces and territories, but particularly those where there are provincial governments that are cooperating and doubling down with us, you are seeing enormous progress. In BC, almost 1 in every 5 vehicles sold right now is an electric vehicle. On the building side of things, which I would say is one of the toughest areas in terms of making progress, we have gone out for consultation with a long-term strategy with respect to how we deal with buildings. We've put in place programming that is both grants and loans to encourage retrofits. And we're actually developing and playing with models, some of which were invented elsewhere, to look at how we can create more replicability in the context of these things so that you can crowd in private capital to help us with what is an enormous challenge in terms of retrofitting buildings. We are seeing announcements in the industrial space almost every week, whether it's green steel or green aluminum or CCUS or hydrogen projects like the Air Products one in Alberta, or battery manufacturing plants, electric vehicle plants, like that whole piece of industrial emissions and the economic opportunity. I think we're seeing progress. And as Steven said on oil and gas, I mean, the cap is something we are working on, but the methane emissions, I mean, you know, people at the beginning said, oh my gosh, you're being so aggressive. Well, Saskatchewan actually has basically met the 2025 commitment already, and Alberta is almost there as well, which shows you, and the average cost per ton is like less than 20 bucks. So we are making progress in a number of areas, but I think the area that I have been spending a lot of time on is kind of not certainly spending time on the emissions reduction side, but spending time on how do you think about building an economy that is going to create jobs and economic prosperity for all Canadians, Canadians who live in every province and territory, in the context of a future that's going to look different. And so we have certainly looked at some of the really big areas of opportunity, like critical minerals, which is not just about mining, it's about minerals processing, it's about battery manufacturing, it's about electric vehicle manufacturing, it's about the recycling of those critical minerals. It's an important end-to-end piece of a broader industrial strategy. Hydrogen, we've been spending an enormous amount of time, and you would have seen some of the work we're doing with the Germans, where we're focused on trying to get to the point where we're exporting hydrogen to Germany by 2025. Very ambitious. We've created these regional energy and resource tables with most of the provinces and territories, and eventually with all of the provinces and territories, to look at place-based economic strategies that look at the big opportunity areas that exist in Nova Scotia and the others that exist in Alberta, because they're very different in this country. We are going to be bringing forward and putting into place contracts for differences to be able to drive capital, because we will create certainty in terms of carbon pricing. And we're working very actively on the just transition, and we're working in partnership with some of our colleagues from the New Democratic Party. So I would say, we are implementing the plan. We are starting to see results. I expect that we're going to see a lot more results. And before I stop, and I will stop, I did want to actually just make one point about the forest accounting issue that the fellow who was doing the interview, I think he was a little bit, well, I didn't quite agree with the way he framed the question. I would say that forest accounting is really important. And the NRDC and the Nature Canada reports are important reports. Canada follows, though, international guidance with respect to forest accounting. And so it's not as easy as just flipping the switch. And I would tell you that my officials and the scientists within NRCan have been engaging very regularly with Nature Canada and NRDC on what are methodology issues. They're accounting issues that are methodological, that Canada can't change on its own. It's important that this is a conversation that's in the international community. So we do right now what is the standard, and we are engaging that conversation. I think that's important, and having those kinds of conversations are important. The way it was framed was a little bit different from that. So
Probably, but I'm not a journalist. So let's go back. Let's stay still in the ERP implementation, Minister Wilkinson, and just let's fast forward a year from now. What are the top priorities for ERP implementation for the next 12 months? And if it's possible, just let's be more specific. When can we expect, for example, a clean electricity regulation, a ZEV mandate, and of course, an oil and gas emission cap? Sorry.
So maybe what I will do is speak to what I think is probably the most important and challenging issue, and then I will let Steven sort of speak to some of the other things that you've mentioned and may want to comment on what I'm saying as well. But I think it's the grid. If I think about the challenges facing us from a grid perspective, I often think of sort of the building of the railway in Canada. This is the kind of scale of what we are talking about. People often think about it in the context of, well, how are you going to phase out coal in the provinces and territories that continue to use coal? And then they think about it in terms of, well, how do you get to a clean grid and deal with natural gas-fired power plants? Those are both important, and they are going to require some very creative solutions in the very short term. But that doesn't account for the doubling or tripling of generation capacity that we are going to need in this country if we are to achieve what we need to achieve, both from an emissions reduction perspective and from an economic perspective. And that's not simple in a country where we've basically used up most of the relevant big hydro projects that are available. There may be some left, and Quebec certainly has some ideas about that, but it's not like we're starting from a place where there's enormous opportunity to secure all of that from hydropower. And so we need to be thinking about how and of course the other complicating factor is every grid in every province and territory is different, and it's regulated differently, and the weaknesses and the strengths of them are all different.
And it's very north-south.
Right, absolutely. And so part of what we need to do is actually work with the provinces and territories. In some cases, it's about ensuring that the regulatory system is such that flexible enough that it actually, and speedy enough that we can actually make the changes we need to make. It's working with them across boundaries in areas where interties are going to be important, like the Atlantic Loop and potentially the interties between Saskatchewan and Manitoba. But it's also developing and really investing in building out the generating capacity. And so we have the SREPS program, which invests in renewable energy projects, but it is at a scale that we are, Minister of Finance isn't here, so it is going to need to be of a much more significant scale for us to actually move forward. And so it will require more federal-provincial collaboration. It will require a lot more creative thinking. It will require more resources. We will be actually bringing forward the Grid Council that we've talked about within the next few months. But I would say people should not underestimate the challenge that we are facing, and it is akin to building of the railway.
I would agree with Jonathan, and to pick up on the clean electricity standard, I mean, it is probably, none of the things we're doing are easy. Amongst the things that aren't easy, this is probably the most difficult, because you have different levels of government, you have public utilities, you have private utilities, system operators, energy regulators, we have a federal energy regulator, we have provincial energy regulators. It is a very complex piece of regulation. And you asked me, what's going to happen in the next 6 months? Well,
12 years, 12 months.
12 months, okay, 12 months. I don't think that we've ever seen a rate of measured deployment by any federal government as what we're seeing now in terms of investment. So IRA, $369 billion. of money that is committed. They haven't started deploying it. We are deploying $109 billion in Canada. So it's less than the United States, but per capita it's 3 times what they're doing. And as the Prime Minister rightly pointed out, we have a number of other tools in our toolbox in order to do that. Contracts for differences. The amount of kudos we got in the ERP from that one paragraph, and unfortunately we can't take any credit for it because it was the investors and companies that said, listen, we want to use this in our business model. We want to bank carbon pricing, but we don't know if it's going to be there 2 years or 5 years from now. We need you to future-proof it. And we were like, oh, okay, well, we're doing it. So, I mean, you will see in the coming months, we will be going on CG1, so Gazette 1 for a number of things. ZEV maybe before Christmas. The oil and gas cap, a matter of months before we're in CG1 as well. The clean electricity standard might I mean, everything. So before it would take us about 5 or 6 years to develop regulations, and now the time frame that we've imposed upon ourselves is about 2 years.
Much more on a fast, we are more on a fast track. So.
We are in a fast track, and it's interesting that we talk about fast track because, you know, until recently we were being told that we were way ahead of the Americans, and oh my God, how dare we be ahead of the Americans? And now with IRA, people are saying, oh my God, you know, we've fallen so far behind the United States. I'm like, well, hold on a second here. I think the Prime Minister rightly pointed out that they're catching up to us, and it's great. We're very happy I mean, we need the United States to be engaged in the U.S., but it has so much effect internationally. We can't fight climate change globally if we don't have the United States of America at the table with us. And before, it was a bit challenging for them because there's not much that they could do, and now they're there, and it's great. It's going to be great business for so many Canadian companies. There is not just in the U.S., but certainly in the U.S. a very serious evaluation of where they're getting some of the critical components that they do to do the transition. And they have this northern neighbor they just so happen to like very much, and Jonathan's a very likable guy. And they're looking at all the critical minerals that we have and all the things that we can provide. So I think that they are seeing in us, and not just us, but, you know, when was the last time that we saw a German chancellor come and spend a week in Canada and to sign an agreement like the one we signed with Newfoundland to get green hydrogen from offshore wind? A number of countries are starting to see Canada as a reliable, stable, low-emitting technology provider and energy provider for the future. Maybe not for next year or the year after that, but for the medium and long term, I think that's what's in it for us. You know, it's about reducing our impact on the environment for sure. It's about fighting climate change, but as Jonathan rightly pointed out, it's about building the economy, the jobs of the future for Canadians.
Juste pour faire du pouce sur les minéraux critiques et stratégiques, somebody was talking this morning on a panel. I think we have to make sure that we need to transform them. La première transformation, la deuxième transformation, et ne pas seulement miser sur l'exportation directement. Je pense que ça aussi, ça créera de la valeur ajoutée pour le Canada.
Ben, j'ai l'impression qu'à chaque fois que je me retourne, il y a François-Philippe Champagne qui a une autre annonce sur un projet de batterie, de transformation. Oui. On est rendu à quoi? 15 milliards de dollars d'investissement au cours de la dernière année et demie, 10 projets industriels soit de fabrication de composantes, de batteries. On va avoir du développement, pas juste de l'extraction des minéraux, mais de la transformation. Dans le passé, ce qu'on a eu un peu de difficulté à faire avec plusieurs de nos ressources naturelles, ben là, on est en train de le faire, et c'est en grande partie grâce à notre ami François-Philippe.
Oui, ouais. On apprend.
Et je voudrais dire que c'est très important. Il y a une grande opportunité. On doit penser beaucoup de comment on peut faire les choses pour assurer que le Canada peut avoir les bénéfices. Mais je crois que nous devons aussi considérer comment on peut assurer que nous faisons les développements dans une manière qui respecte l'environnement, mais aussi qui peut assurer que nous pouvons engager et collaborer avec les Autochtones.
Les peuples autochtones.
Et ce n'est pas possible pour nous d'avoir les mines, par exemple, dans lesquelles il n'y a pas les bénéfices qui
vont aux communautés.
Exactement.
Oui,
Et on doit penser de ça, mais il y a beaucoup d'opportunités, je crois,
Tout à
pour le
fait.
Canada.
Oui, merci. Ministre Guilbeault, on sort d'un été où les fleuves en Europe ont été asséchés, canicule record en Chine, sécheresse dans l'Ouest, Fiona a fait des dommages incroyables sur la côte Est. Pensez-vous que finalement tous ces événements météorologiques liés au changement climatique convainquent davantage de personnes, mais aussi de décideurs? On parlait tantôt du débat politique autour des changements climatiques, mais est-ce que ces gens-là sont davantage convaincus quant à la nécessité de faire la carboneutralité une priorité encore plus grande?
C'est un peu paradoxal parce que on parle des changements climatiques depuis très longtemps. J'étais à la première conférence des partis des Nations unies sur les changements climatiques en 1995, la COP 1 à Berlin. J'ai peut-être été vu avec d'autres militants en train de barrer les portes en disant aux délégués
C'est pas moi qui le
qu'ils
dis.
n'avaient pas terminé leurs négociations. On n'avait pas toutes barré les portes pour des raisons de sécurité, bien évidemment. On en avait laissé quelques-unes ouvertes. Mais on a perdu beaucoup de temps. C'est particulièrement vrai au Canada, c'est vrai de façon générale à l'échelle planétaire. Si on avait écouté les scientifiques en 1990, en 1995, parce que dans le fond, ce qu'on sait aujourd'hui, on en sait un peu plus, c'est plus granulaire, c'est plus détaillé, mais on le savait en 1990, on le savait en 1995. La situation ne serait probablement pas celle dans laquelle nous sommes aujourd'hui. Je parlais avec Jonathan tantôt qui me disait qu'en Colombie-Britannique, vous êtes dans certaines régions 100 jours sans une goutte de pluie.
Plus de 100 jours.
Plus de 100 jours sans une goutte de pluie. Il se passe rarement une journée sans qu'on ait de mauvaises nouvelles par rapport aux impacts des changements climatiques, que ce soit ici ou ailleurs. Et hélas, sur la tarification carbone, par exemple, qui est soit le meilleur outil ou certainement l'un des meilleurs outils pour lutter contre la pollution, bien, j'ai la majorité des premiers ministres provinciaux qui disent « Non, non, pas ici, c'est pas le bon moment, ça ne sera jamais le bon moment. Ça sera, si pas maintenant, quand est-ce qu'on va le faire? » Et il y a une catégorie de politiciens au Canada, puis on n'a pas le monopole là-dessus, mais qui pensent qu'on peut lutter contre les changements climatiques, mais ça va se faire tout seul, qu'il n'y aura pas d'effort. Ça marche pas comme ça. Et l'implication, je pense que Jonathan et moi pouvons témoigner du fait qu'on ne pourrait pas faire ce qu'on fait si ce n'était du premier ministre, qui est toujours là pour nous appuyer. Sur la tarification carbone, j'avais 7 premiers ministres sur le dos qui ne voulaient rien savoir. Il a fait une entrevue où il a dit, bien des premiers ministres provinciaux qui font preuve de désinformation sur la question de la tarification. À partir du moment où il a fait ça, le signal était très clair. Tous ceux qui ne voulaient pas travailler avec nous sur la tarification carbone, 48 heures plus tard le faisaient. Alors, est-ce que j'aimerais vous dire que les catastrophes naturelles vont aider à faire prendre conscience à l'ensemble de notre classe politique de l'importance d'agir sur les changements climatiques, mais période de questions après période de questions, Jonathan et moi, on fait face à une opposition officielle qui, sans nier la réalité des changements climatiques, s'oppose à toute mesure significative qui nous permettrait de réduire la pollution.
En fait, je pense que mon collègue Simon, ce matin, parlait de courage. Donc, on vous encourage à avoir beaucoup de courage. Je pense que vous avez ici un auditoire qui va vous soutenir de toute façon. Alors, je pense qu'il faut poursuivre dans cette direction-là. Ministre Wilkinson, vous avez beaucoup parlé des impératifs économiques qui sont liés à la carboneutralité, du fait que cette transition accélérée va justement constituer une opportunité économique très importante pour le Canada. Opportunité qu'il se doit de saisir, évidemment. Alors, concrètement, qu'est-ce que fait le gouvernement fédéral pour mieux justement positionner le Canada sur la voie de cette prospérité économique quand il s'agit de carboneutralité?
Oui, c'est un enjeu très important. Je dis souvent que nous devons donner aux Canadiens l'idée que l'avenir peut être un avenir prospère. Sinon, les Canadiens pensent qu'il y a beaucoup de problèmes et beaucoup de travail que nous allons perdu. Bien sûr, ça va être très difficile d'avoir le soutien pour combattre le changement climatique. Mais la bonne chose pour le Canada, c'est que nous avons beaucoup de choses que le monde a besoin. Comme les minéraux critiques, bien sûr, je dis que les États-Unis, le Japon, la Corée du Sud, l'Union européenne, toutes veulent avoir les conversations avec nous pour avoir accès aux minéraux critiques. La même chose avec l'hydrogène. Nous avons beaucoup de ressources dans l'ouest du Canada, dans l'est du Canada, et nous pouvons utiliser ces ressources pour exporter l'hydrogène. Bien sûr, nous devons utiliser l'hydrogène ici aussi, mais pour exporter. Et nous avons maintenant un accord avec l'Allemagne et nous parlons avec beaucoup d'autres sur ces sujets. Mais comme j'ai dit, je crois que, et nous devons avoir les utiles pour soutenir les opportunités comme le fonds d'investissement stratégique, comme les fonds pour les combustibles propres, comme le banque infrastructure, tous les utiles pour accélérer le travail que nous devons faire si nous voulons saisir les opportunités. Mais aussi, comme j'ai dit, nous devons être sensibles de toutes les provinces et les territoires. Et nous devons avoir une conversation dans chaque province et territoire le sujet de comment est-ce que leurs enfants peuvent avoir les opportunités que nous avons durant nos vies. Et ça, c'est le travail de les tables rondes, de ressources et énergie. Et je crois qu'il y a beaucoup d'exemples de progrès, mais c'est quelque chose qui est juste as important que le travail de réduire les émissions de gaz à effet de serre.
Parfait. Le temps file et je sais que vous avez un devoir. La démocratie vous appelle.
Nous avons
Un vote à faire. Alors, many thanks again to both of you and for taking the time to be here today, d'avoir partagé vos perspectives. C'est vraiment grandement apprécié. Alors, merci infiniment et puis